The champagne glass shattered before anyone even understood why. Narina Vale froze, her tray tilted at an angle, one small trickle of red wine sliding down the white tablecloth like a wound opening in slow motion. For half a second, the entire private dining hall of Moretti Royale went quiet enough to hear the ice melting in the buckets. Then the laughter started. It began at the far end of the table, a woman in diamonds smothering a giggle behind her napkin, and spread like a spark catching dry grass. Within seconds, half the guests were smirking, whispering, enjoying the small humiliation of a waitress who had clearly worked one shift too many that night. Narina's face burned, but she didn't cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears only fed an audience like this one. She bent down, silent, and began cleaning the mess with steady hands, even as her chest tightened with exhaustion.
6 hours into a double shift, her feet throbbed inside shoes a size too small, and her mind kept drifting, as it always did, to her father, lying in a hospital bed miles away, waiting for a surgery bill she still hadn't figured out how to pay. She didn't notice at first that the laughter had gone quiet again. She didn't notice the man at the head of the table watching her the way a predator watches something unexpected wander into its territory. Cassian Moretti wasn't the kind of man who noticed waitresses. He owned this restaurant, half this city block, and, depending on who you asked in certain circles, considerably more than that. He was used to silence following him into a room, not preceding some clumsy accident. But something about the girl's stillness, the way she hadn't flinched at the mockery, made him set down his glass.
"You," he said, his voice low but carrying easily across the table. "Do you think you deserve to be laughed at?" The room's amusement sharpened into something crueler, hungrier for a show. Narina straightened slowly, tray still balanced against her hip, and met his eyes without blinking.
"No,"
she said simply.
"I don't."
A ripple of surprise moved through the guests. Nobody spoke to Cassian Moretti like that. Nobody dared. He leaned back in his chair, studying her the way he studied men across a negotiating table, searching for the crack, the weakness, the thing that would make her back down. "Then prove it," he said, and something like amusement curled at the edge of his mouth. "Dance for us, right now, if you're so sure you deserve respect instead of pity." It was meant to humiliate her further. Everyone in the room understood that, and half of them were already smiling in anticipation of watching her stammer an excuse and retreat to the kitchen in shame. Narina set the tray down on the nearest empty table. She didn't answer him with words. She kicked off her shoes. A murmur moved through the crowd, uncertain now, as she stepped onto the small open space near the center of the room. The same space where, an hour earlier, a string quartet had played soft background music for people who weren't even listening. She rolled her shoulders back. She lifted her chin, and for one suspended second, she looked less like an exhausted waitress and more like something else entirely. Something coiled and waiting. Then she began to move. It wasn't the awkward, self-conscious swaying anyone expected. Her arms lifted with a precision that belonged in a ballroom, not a restaurant floor. Her feet, bare against the marble, traced patterns too clean, too trained to be accidental. She spun, and her body found the exact center of its own balance, the way only years of discipline could teach a person. Every turn had purpose. Every pause had weight.
The laughter died completely. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations dissolved into stunned silence.
Even the waitstaff peeking out from the kitchen doors stood frozen, dish towels forgotten in their hands. Narina moved like something remembered from another life, a life none of these people knew existed, a life she'd buried so deep she sometimes convinced herself it had happened to someone else. When she finished, chest rising and falling, arms settling gracefully at her sides, nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then the room exploded into applause. Guests who had been mocking her minutes earlier were now on their feet, some even wiping their eyes. murmuring words like extraordinary and how does a waitress dance like that? Narina bent down, retrieved her shoes without a word, and walked calmly back toward the kitchen, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But Cassian Moretti hadn't clapped. He sat perfectly still, elbows on the table, eyes narrowed. Not with mockery anymore, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. He had seen movements like that exactly once before, years ago, on a grainy television broadcast he'd almost forgotten. Elite footwork, competition-level posture, the kind of training that cost fortunes and took a decade to perfect. Not something a waitress picked up cleaning tables between shifts. Whoever this girl really was, she was not who she claimed to be. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cassian Moretti felt something stir in his chest that wasn't boredom, wasn't calculation, wasn't the cold detachment he wore like armor. It was curiosity. Dangerous, consuming curiosity. He watched the kitchen door swing shut behind her, and he knew, with the same certainty he trusted in every business deal, every quiet threat, every careful move that had built his empire, that he was not going to let this go. Whoever Narina Vale used to be, he intended to find out. Cassian Moretti did not sleep that night. He sat in his office on the top floor of the Moretti Tower, the city lights spread out beneath him like scattered coins, and replayed the dance over and over in his mind. Not the way a man remembers something beautiful, but the way he studied a contract for a hidden clause. Something about it didn't add up, and Cassian hated things that didn't add up. By morning, he had already made a call. "Find everything on her," he told Dario, his most trusted and most discreet investigator. "Narina Vale, waitress at Moretti Royale. I want her whole life on my desk by tonight." But when the file arrived, it was almost insultingly thin. A birth certificate, a high school record, 2 years of restaurant employment, always day shifts turned into double shifts. No family listed except a father, Andre Vale, currently registered as a long-term patient at Grovewood Rehabilitation Center. No mention of dance schools, competitions, or trophies. No hint of the woman who had commanded an entire restaurant into silence with nothing but her bare feet and years of hidden discipline. It was too clean. People who worked that hard to disappear were usually running from something, or protecting something even more valuable than money. Cassian decided he would find out himself. He arrived at Grovewood Rehabilitation Center that afternoon, dressed down in a plain black coat instead of his usual tailored suits, hoping to blend into the quiet hallway of wheelchairs and physical therapists. It didn't work. Heads turned anyway. A man like Cassian Moretti carried authority even in silence. He found Narina in a small therapy room, guiding her father's hand along a walking bar, encouraging him with a patience that surprised Cassian more than her dancing had. Andre Vale's legs trembled with every step, his face twisted with quiet frustration, but Narina never once looked tired of repeating the same instructions.
Almost there, Papa. One more step.
When she noticed Cassian standing in the doorway, her spine went rigid.
"What are you doing here?"
she asked, voice low so her father wouldn't hear the edge in it. "I came to see you," Cassian said simply.
"You don't know me."
"I intend to fix that." She guided her father back into his wheelchair, thanked the nurse hovering nearby, and stepped into the hallway, arms crossed, clearly unwilling to let this conversation happen anywhere near her father's ears.
"Whatever this is," she said, "I'm not interested."
"I haven't offered you anything yet."
"You will. Men like you always do."
Her eyes flicked over his coat, his watch, the quiet confidence that clung to him like cologne.
"And it always comes with a price you don't mention until it's too late."
Cassian studied her for a long moment. She wasn't wrong. He had built an empire on offers exactly like that. But something about her directness disarmed him in a way threats and negotiations never did. "Your father's treatment,"
he said instead. "I could cover it, all of it. The surgery, the therapy, whatever comes after." He expected gratitude. He expected relief, maybe tears, maybe the kind of desperate thank you he'd seen from people drowning in medical debt his whole life. Instead, Narina's jaw tightened. "No. You didn't even ask the amount. It doesn't matter what the amount is." Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from something sharper, old pain resurfacing. "The last time someone powerful offered to help me, it cost me everything I had. I'm not making that mistake again." Cassian frowned. "What happened to you?" "None of your business." She turned to walk back into the therapy room, but Cassian's eyes had already drifted toward the small backpack she'd left on a bench in the hallway, unzipped just enough to reveal a glint of tarnished silver poking out from beneath a folded sweater. "Narina," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her pause. "What is that?" She followed his gaze, and her face went pale. She crossed the hallway in 3 quick steps and zipped the bag shut, but not before Cassian had seen it clearly enough. A dance trophy. Old, scratched, missing part of its engraved plaque, but unmistakably a championship trophy, the kind awarded only at the highest levels of competition. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "That's not nothing," Cassian said. "That's a national-level trophy. I recognize the design. I've sponsored enough events to know one when I see it." Narina's hands trembled slightly as she slung the backpack over her shoulder, refusing to meet his eyes. "It's from a long time ago, a different life. It has nothing to do with who I am now." "Doesn't it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked back into the therapy room, closing the door firmly behind her. Not to punish him, Castian realized, but because she was hiding from something far more dangerous than his money. He stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the closed door. Whatever happened in Narina Vale's past hadn't just ended a career. It had frightened her badly enough to bury an entire identity, work double shifts in silence, and refuse help from one of the most powerful men in the city, rather than risk anyone getting close enough to ask questions. Cassian Moretti had spent his whole life reading people, liars, rivals, men who smiled while planning betrayal behind their backs, and every instinct he had told him the same thing now. Narina Vale wasn't protecting her pride, she was protecting a secret, and whoever had made her this afraid once still had power over her now. He intended to find out who. Cassian didn't chase answers through lawyers or paperwork this time. Secrets like Narina's didn't live in official records. They lived in the memories of people who'd been pushed aside and forgotten, the ones nobody thought to silence, because nobody thought they mattered anymore. He started with retired dance instructors. The first 2 he visited barely remembered anything useful, offering vague praise about talented students who came and went over the years. But the third, a stooped old man named Instructor Pavel, who now taught community classes in a dusty studio above a laundromat, went quiet the moment Cassian said the name Narina Vale. "The Silver Swan," Pavel murmured, almost reverently. "I haven't heard that name in 10 years. "Tell me about her," Cassian said. Pavel's eyes drifted toward the studio window, toward memories only he could see. She was the youngest national ballroom champion this city ever produced, 14 years old when she started, 17 when she took the title. Everyone said she would go on to win internationally. Nobody danced like her. Such control, such fire. She was destined for greatness. "What happened to her?" Pavel's expression darkened. "The final competition, the championship that would have sent her to represent the country abroad. Something went wrong on stage. The lighting rig malfunctioned mid-performance. She fell. Badly. It ended her career overnight." "An accident?" Pavel hesitated, glancing toward the door as if worried someone might be listening. "That's what everyone was told. But there were whispers back then among instructors who knew the industry. Whispers about sabotage, about certain officials who wanted a different dancer to win, a dancer with more powerful sponsors. Cassian's jaw tightened. Who were these officials? Pavel shook his head quickly. I don't know names. I only know rumors, and the rumors got people fired back then if they talked too loudly. Narina disappeared after that. Just vanished. Some said she left the city out of shame. Others said she was paid to stay silent. It wasn't enough. Cassian needed proof, not whispers. He spent the next 2 days digging through archived competition records at the City Dance Federation's old storage facility. Favors called in, palms greased, doors quietly opened that should have stayed locked to outsiders. Buried in a decade-old file, he found something that made his blood run cold. An internal memo referencing equipment concerns the night of the championship final, followed immediately by a note stating the matter had been resolved and closed, no further action required. No investigation, no inquiry, just silence, purchased and filed away. And connected to almost every document, appearing again and again in board approvals and sponsorship signatures from that era, was one name: Gideon Ashcroft. Cassian didn't recognize the name immediately, but something about seeing it repeated so consistently, so carefully positioned in the background of Narina's downfall, told him this was no coincidence. He didn't get the chance to dig further that day because his phone buzzed with a message from Dario. She knows someone's asking questions. She's furious. Thought you should know before you go anywhere near her. Cassian went anyway. He found Narina outside the rehabilitation center that evening, pacing near the entrance with her arms crossed tightly against the cold, clearly waiting for him. You had no right, she said the moment she saw him, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear this time. You had no right to go digging through my past like it's some puzzle for you to solve. Narina, do you know what it took for me to bury that part of my life? She snapped, stepping closer, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Do you know how many years it took to stop hearing my own name, my old name, every time I closed my eyes? I built a new life, a quiet one, and you just walked in and started tearing it apart because you were curious. I found something, Cassian said carefully, about the accident, about what really happened that night. Narina froze. What? It wasn't an accident, he said. There are records, buried ones, suggesting the equipment failure was intentional. Sabotage. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Hope, maybe, or old grief resurfacing violently. Then her expression hardened again, walls rebuilding themselves brick by brick. It doesn't matter, she said quietly. Nothing you find will bring back what I lost. It won't undo 10 years of hiding, of pretending I'm someone else just to survive. So stop. Please, just stop digging. Someone tried to destroy your life on purpose, Cassian said. Doesn't that deserve the truth? The truth already destroyed me once, Narina said, her voice breaking. I won't survive it a second time. She turned and walked back inside without another word, leaving Cassian standing alone in the cold, the weight of what he'd uncovered pressing heavier than he expected. He looked down at his phone, at the name still glowing on the screen from Dario's earlier message, Gideon Ashcroft, cross-referenced now with board memberships, charity galas, television appearances celebrating his rise as one of the city's most respected philanthropists. A man like that didn't just fade into obscurity after ruining a 17-year-old girl's entire future. Men like that climbed higher, protected themselves better, buried their crimes so deep that even a decade later, the woman they'd destroyed was too terrified to say their name out loud. Cassian slipped his phone into his pocket, his expression darkening with something colder and more familiar than curiosity now. Whatever Gideon Ashcroft had done to Narina Vale 10 years ago, Cassian intended to make sure it finally came back to destroy him. Cassian understood something about Narina now that he hadn't understood before.
She didn't need saving. She needed a reason to stop hiding. So instead of pushing her further, he did something quieter. He organized a charity gala, officially a fundraiser for athletes recovering from career-ending injuries, the kind of respectable event that fit his public image as a businessman, rather than the man whispered about in darker circles. Unofficially, it was built around one purpose only: bringing instructor Pavel back into Narina's life without her feeling cornered into it. The invitation to Pavel came with no mention of Narina at all. The invitation to Narina came from the rehabilitation center itself, framed as a thank you event for donors supporting patients like her father. She had no reason to suspect Cassian's hand behind either one. When she walked into the ballroom that evening and saw her old instructor standing near the dance floor, tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them.
"Pavel," she whispered.
"My silver swan," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "Look at you, still holding yourself like a champion, even after all these years."
"I'm not her anymore,"
Narina said quietly. "I don't believe that," Pavel replied. "Not for 1 second." He didn't push her to compete, didn't mention championships or trophies or the accident that ended everything. He simply asked her to dance with him one more time, just once, for old memories, nothing more. Something in his gentle persistence, the warmth of a man who had believed in her before the world decided to forget her, made refusing impossible. She agreed to one final exhibition performance for the gala's closing event. Nothing official, nothing competitive, just a private tribute to injured athletes rebuilding their lives. A small stage, a small audience, nothing that should have mattered beyond that room. Rehearsals began the following week in a private studio Cassian arranged, and for the first time, he saw a side of Narina the restaurant crowd never had. Not the composed woman who refused his money, and not the furious woman who accused him of destroying her privacy, but someone raw, uncertain, rediscovering movements she'd forced herself to forget. She stumbled during a turn one afternoon, frustration boiling over as she pressed her palms against her eyes.
"I can't do this," she said. "My body remembers, but my mind keeps waiting for something to go wrong, for the lights to fail again, for everything to fall apart the way it did before."
Cassian, who had been quietly observing from the studio doorway, stepped inside for the first time. "It won't," he said. "I'll make sure of it, personally."
"You can't promise that."
"I can promise I'll be watching every wire, every switch, every person near that stage," he said. "Nobody sabotages anything on my watch. Not this time." Something about his certainty, not comforting words, but the same cold precision he used running his empire, steadied her more than sympathy ever could. Over the following days, their conversations shifted. They stopped circling each other with suspicion and started speaking honestly, sometimes about nothing important at all: her father's slow recovery, his childhood memories of a family he rarely mentioned. Small pieces of themselves offered without demand. Cassian found himself staying long after rehearsals ended, not out of obligation, but because her presence had become something he looked forward to, rather than calculated.
"Why do you care so much about this?"
Narina asked him one evening, watching him review security details for the gala with the same intensity he probably used for far more dangerous matters. "About me? About some sabotage from 10 years ago that has nothing to do with you?" Cassian considered the question longer than she expected. "Because someone decided you didn't deserve the life you earned," he said finally. "And I've spent my whole life around men who take things they don't deserve. I'm tired of watching people like that win." She didn't have a response for that. She simply nodded, something unspoken passing between them that neither was ready to name yet. The gala arrived faster than expected. Narina's performance that night wasn't flawless. She hesitated once, her breath catching during a difficult turn. But it was honest, emotional, and utterly captivating. The small audience rose to their feet, moved not just by her technique, but by something rawer underneath it. A woman clawing her way back to herself in real time. Someone in the crowd recorded the performance and posted it online, intending only to celebrate the charity event.
Within hours, it had spread far beyond anyone's expectations. Across the city, in a private study filled with awards and framed newspaper clippings, celebrating a decade of philanthropic success, Gideon Ashcroft sat alone with a glass of scotch, scrolling through his phone out of idle curiosity about the gala his rivals had attended without inviting him. He nearly dropped the glass when the video autoplayed. The posture, the precision, the unmistakable fire in her movements that no training could fully erase, no matter how many years passed. Gideon set his glass down slowly, his expression shifting from mild interest to something colder, sharper, far more calculating. "Impossible," he murmured. He replayed the video twice more, studying her face carefully despite the years that had changed it. There was no mistake. The woman he had destroyed a decade ago, the woman he'd paid, threatened, and buried so deep that even her own name had disappeared from public memory, had somehow crawled her way back into the light. Gideon leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. He had eliminated her once already, quietly, efficiently, without a single fingerprint pointing back to him. If Narina Vale intended to return, he intended to make sure she disappeared permanently this time. The first sign that something had changed came 3 days after the gala, when Narina's father received a call from the rehabilitation center's billing department. "There's been an issue," the woman on the phone explained, apologetic but firm. "The charitable fund covering the remainder of Mr. Vale's treatment has been withdrawn, effective immediately. I'm sorry, I don't have further details." Narina stared at her phone for a long moment after the call ended, a cold, familiar dread settling into her stomach. It wasn't a coincidence. Nothing about her life had ever fallen apart by coincidence. She called Cassian before she even finished processing the fear. "Someone pulled my father's funding," she said, her voice tight, "right after that video went online." Cassian's response was immediate and calm, the voice of a man who had expected exactly this. "I'll cover it, whatever it costs." "That's not the point," Narina snapped. "The point is someone is sending a message. They want me to know they're still watching, still capable of hurting the people I love." "Gideon Ashcroft," Cassian said quietly. "You think it's him?" "I know it's him." He explained what he'd uncovered, the buried memo, the sabotage rumors, the name connected to every document surrounding her downfall. Narina listened in silence, old fear and fresh anger warring across her face. "I hate this," she whispered. "I hate needing you. I hate that the only reason I'm not drowning right now is because a man I barely trust is willing to write a check." "Then don't think of it as needing me," Cassian said. "Think of it as both of us wanting the same thing. Justice." She didn't answer, but she didn't argue either. That night, someone broke into her apartment. She returned from a late shift to find the door slightly ajar, the lock forced, drawers pulled open, and her small collection of old dance memorabilia scattered across the floor. The trophy gone, along with a folder of yellowed newspaper clippings she'd kept hidden beneath her mattress for a decade. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted money or valuables. They wanted evidence, proof of who she used to be, and perhaps proof of what really happened that night, 10 years ago. She called Cassian immediately, hands trembling too hard to dial twice. He arrived within 20 minutes with 2 of his men, his expression darker than she'd ever seen it. "They're not just threatening you anymore," he said, examining the forced lock with a controlled fury. "They're trying to erase every piece of evidence connecting Ashcroft to what happened." "Which means he's scared," Narina said slowly. "Scared enough to risk exposing himself by coming after me directly." "Which makes him dangerous," Cassian said. "Scared men make desperate mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes hurt people." He moved her and her belongings to a secured property that night, without giving her much room to argue, and though she resented the loss of control, some quiet part of her felt safer than she had in years. 2 days later, Dario surfaced with a lead that changed everything. "There's a man," he told Cassian, "retired stage technician, worked lighting rigs for the Dance Federation almost 15 years, including the night of Narina's championship.
He went quiet after the accident, moved twice, changed jobs completely, cut off contact with almost everyone in the industry. People who disappeared that thoroughly usually saw something they were paid or scared to forget. They found him living alone above a hardware store in the warehouse district, a nervous, aging man named Thomas Reyes, who nearly slammed the door shut the moment Cassian mentioned the championship. "I don't know anything," Reyes said quickly. Too quickly. "We know someone paid you to stay silent," Cassian said, his voice calm but unmistakably threatening in its steadiness. "We're not here to hurt you. We're here to stop the man who ruined an innocent woman's life and is still trying to finish the job." Reyes hesitated, glancing nervously toward the window, as if expecting someone to be watching even now. "They'll finish me," he whispered. "They won't get the chance," Cassian said. "I'll make sure of it, personally." Something about his tone, the same cold, absolute certainty Narina had come to recognize, seemed to break through the man's fear. Reyes led them to a small storage unit he'd rented under a false name, filled with boxes he hadn't opened in a decade. Inside, beneath old equipment manuals, he retrieved a small hard drive. "I filmed the rig before the malfunction," he admitted, hands shaking as he handed it over. "Standard procedure, back then, for insurance purposes. I saw the wiring had been deliberately altered hours before her performance. Cuts too clean to be accidental, positioned exactly where the failure would cause maximum damage during her most difficult routine. I was going to report it, but someone reached out to me first, offered me enough money to disappear quietly instead. I was scared. I took it. I've regretted it every day since." Cassian stared at the small drive in his palm, aware of exactly how much weight it carried. "Who paid you?" he asked. Reyes swallowed hard. "I never saw him directly, just his assistant. But the account the money came from, I kept a record, just in case I ever needed protection of my own." He handed over a folded slip of paper with account details that, once cross-referenced through Cassian's contacts, would trace directly back to a shell company controlled by one man, Gideon Ashcroft. For the first time since this began, Cassian allowed himself something close to satisfaction. They finally had proof. But proof alone wouldn't be enough. Not against a man with Gideon's money, his connections, his decade of carefully built respectability. They would need more, and judging by how quickly Gideon had already struck twice, he wasn't going to give them much time to gather it. The countryside property Cassian chose sat at the edge of a quiet lake, far enough from the city that no one would think to look there, close enough that Dario could reach them within the hour if anything went wrong. It was the kind of place Narina never imagined a man like Cassian Moretti would own. Modest, wooden, warm with morning light instead of marble and chandeliers. Her father settled in slowly, his physical therapist visiting twice a week to continue his recovery, and for the first time in years, Narina allowed herself to breathe without constantly glancing over her shoulder. She found an old ballroom on the property's second floor, dusty and forgotten, its wooden floor scratched but sound. She hadn't planned to use it. But one evening, restless and unable to sleep, she wandered inside anyway, and before she understood what she was doing, her body had already begun moving through old routines her mind had tried for years to forget. Cassian found her there past midnight, moonlight spilling through tall windows, her bare feet gliding across the floor with a freedom he hadn't seen from her before, not performing for an audience, not proving anything to anyone, just dancing because it was the only language that let her feel fully alive. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched from the doorway until she noticed him and stopped, slightly breathless, slightly embarrassed. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Neither could I," he said, stepping inside. "I keep thinking about Reyes, about how many other people Gideon silenced over the years without anyone noticing." Narina sat down on the edge of the old stage, patting the space beside her. Cassian hesitated only a moment before joining her. "Tell me about your family," she said quietly.
You never talk about them. Something shifted in his expression, the careful control slipping just slightly. There isn't much to tell that ends well, he said. My father built this empire through fear. My mother left when I was young, tired of living inside that fear herself. And my younger brother... He paused, jaw tightening. He died in a deal gone wrong when I was 23, betrayed by a man he trusted. I took over everything after that, and I told myself I'd never make the mistake of trusting anyone again. And now? Narina asked softly. Cassian looked at her, something raw and unguarded crossing his face for the first time since she'd met him. Now I don't know how to trust anyone. But somehow, I trust you. Why? Because you've had 1,000 reasons to lie to me, manipulate me, use my money and my power the way everyone else does, he said. And you've never once tried. Narina studied him for a long moment, something loosening in her chest that had stayed tightly wound for 10 years. I trust you too, she admitted quietly. More than I expected to. More than I probably should, considering everything you are. Everything I am, Cassian repeated slowly. And what's that exactly? A man who could destroy someone with a phone call, she said, but somehow chooses to protect people instead. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that night, though something had clearly shifted. A fragile trust neither wanted to name too quickly, afraid of breaking whatever peace they'd found in that quiet ballroom. The peace didn't last. 3 days later, Narina's phone buzzed with a message from a friend still working at Moretti Royale, followed quickly by a flood of similar messages from numbers she barely recognized. Have you seen this? She opened the link with trembling hands. A tabloid article had gone viral overnight, citing anonymous sources close to the Dance Federation, claiming the sabotage story surrounding Narina Vale's championship accident had been entirely fabricated, a desperate publicity stunt designed to manufacture sympathy for a failed comeback attempt. The article painted her as manipulative, attention-seeking, willing to fake a decade-old tragedy for relevance. Comments beneath it multiplied by the hour, cruel and merciless. Exactly the kind of public mockery she'd spent 10 years hiding from.
They're calling me a liar, Narina said, staring at her phone in disbelief when Cassian found her outside, pale and shaking. After everything that actually happened to me, they're twisting it into something I supposedly did to myself.
It's Gideon, Cassian said grimly, scanning the article himself. He can't destroy the evidence anymore, so he's destroying your credibility instead. If enough people believe you fabricated the sabotage story, nobody will believe the truth even when we release it. It's working, Narina said quietly. Look at the comments. People believed me for exactly 3 days before deciding I'm a fraud. People believe whatever story reaches them first and loudest, Cassian said, which means we need a louder one, a truer one. Narina wrapped her arms around herself, exhaustion and old grief pressing down harder than they had in years. I thought I was done being afraid, she whispered. I thought coming back, dancing again, trusting you. I thought it meant I'd finally moved past what he did to me. You have, Cassian said firmly, stepping closer. This isn't you falling apart, Narina. This is him panicking. Innocent people don't panic like this. Guilty men do. She looked up at him, searching his face for the certainty she desperately needed to hear. Promise me we'll finish this, she said. Promise me he doesn't win. Cassian took her hand gently, his grip steady despite the storm building behind his calm expression. I promise, he said. Whatever it takes. Gideon Ashcroft is not walking away from this untouched. Somewhere in the city, unaware that his latest attack had only deepened the resolve between them rather than breaking it, Gideon Ashcroft was already planning his next move. One final attempt to bury the truth before it could bury him. The call came from a number Narina didn't recognize, 3 days after the tabloid story broke. Miss Vale, my name is Miriam Okafor.
I used to work as a sports journalist for the network that broadcast your championship final 10 years ago. The woman's voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this call many times before finding the courage to make it. I think I have something you need to see. They met that afternoon at a small cafe far from the city center, Cassian sitting quietly beside Narina while Miriam slid a tablet across the table with trembling hands. I was young when I covered your final, Miriam said. Junior reporter, barely trusted with anything important, but I filmed extra footage that night for a behind-the-scenes segment. Rehearsal footage, backstage interviews, things that never aired because the network pulled the entire story after your accident. She pressed play. The footage showed the stage hours before Narina's performance, technicians moving through routine checks. But there, in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a man in an unfamiliar uniform crouched near the lighting rig, adjusting wires with quick, deliberate movements before disappearing off-camera entirely. I didn't think anything of it at the time, Miriam admitted. But after your gala video went viral, and then that tabloid story tried to paint you as a fraud, I pulled my old archives. I recognized him immediately once I looked closely. That's not standard maintenance. That's sabotage, caught on tape. Narina stared at the screen, her hands pressed against her mouth. 10 years of buried grief and confusion suddenly given a face. A moment. Undeniable proof that she hadn't imagined the wrongness of that night. Why didn't this air? Cassian asked.
The network received a call the next morning, Miriam said quietly. Legal threats, an enormous advertising contract suddenly at risk. My editor buried the story entirely, told everyone the accident was ruled equipment failure, closed case. I kept the raw footage because something about it never sat right with me. I just never had the courage to come forward. Not until now. Cassian exchanged a glance with Narina, both of them understanding the weight of what they now held. This isn't enough on its own, Cassian said carefully. We need to connect this directly to Gideon. That evening, working through contacts even Dario didn't usually access, Cassian traced the financial trail buried within Reyes's account records. What emerged was staggering in its scope. Payments routed through 3 separate shell companies, all eventually connecting back to accounts controlled by Gideon Ashcroft, dated in the weeks surrounding the championship. Bribes to a lighting technician, payments to 2 judges who had scored Narina unusually low in preliminary rounds before her final performance. A settlement paid quietly to the network executive who buried Miriam's original story. It wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was a documented, methodical conspiracy to destroy a 17-year-old girl's career because, as Cassian eventually discovered through old sponsorship records, Gideon had personally invested in a rival dancer that year, a young man whose family owed Gideon considerable favors and whose victory would have secured Gideon's growing influence within the Dance Federation's board. He didn't just want to win, Narina said quietly, staring at the documents spread across the table. He destroyed me because I was inconveniently better than the dancer he'd already bet everything on. And he spent 10 years since building a reputation as a respected philanthropist, Cassian said grimly, making it that much harder for anyone to believe he's capable of something like this. Gathering the evidence hadn't come without cost. Twice that week, Cassian's men intercepted attempts to access the storage facility housing the archived Federation documents, clearly Gideon's people trying to erase what remained before it could surface publicly. Miriam herself received an anonymous, thinly veiled threat, warning her to remember what happened last time she considered speaking up. We move now, Cassian said, before he finds a way to bury this again. But it was during those final tense days of preparation, verifying documents, securing witnesses, building an airtight case strong enough to survive Gideon's inevitable counterattack, that Narina found herself watching Cassian differently than she had before. He never once tried to control the story, or control her. He didn't suggest she stay quiet and let him handle everything on her behalf, didn't try to position himself as her savior in whatever narrative eventually reached the public. Every decision, every step forward,
he brought back to her first.
"This is your story," he told her one night, reviewing the final case file together. "Your name, your career, your fight. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it with you." "You could have controlled all of this," Narina said quietly, studying him. "The information, the timing, even me. You had every opportunity." "I thought about it," Cassian admitted honestly. "Old habits. But somewhere along the way, I realized controlling you wasn't what I wanted. I just wanted to see you win. Truly win. Not because I handed it to you, but because you finally got the chance to fight with the truth on your side." Something settled in Narina's chest then, a realization she hadn't let herself fully accept until that moment. Cassian Moretti, a man capable of ruthless calculation, careful manipulation, and quiet, dangerous power, had spent weeks proving he wanted none of that with her. He had simply refused to let the truth stay buried, exactly as she'd once accused him of interfering. Except now, she understood it had never been about control at all. It had been about giving her back what Gideon stole. By the end of that week, they had everything they needed: the footage, the financial records, Reyes's testimony, Pavel's history, and Miriam's corroborating account. Enough evidence to finally bring Gideon Ashcroft's carefully constructed reputation crashing down. The only question left was whether the Dance Federation and the public would be ready to hear it. The Dance Federation's emergency board meeting lasted almost 6 hours. Cassian and Narina arrived with lawyers, not weapons, documents instead of threats, though the quiet, unshakable authority Cassian carried into the room made it clear exactly what would happen if the board tried to bury this the way it had buried the truth 10 years earlier. Miriam's footage played first, followed by Reyes's recorded testimony, the financial records, and finally Pavel's account of the whispers he'd heard, back when everyone was too afraid to speak them aloud. By the time the evidence finished playing, several board members refused to meet Gideon Ashcroft's eyes across the table. He tried, briefly, to deny everything, dismissing the footage as inconclusive, the financial records as coincidental, the testimony as bitter fabrication from people he claimed to barely know. But the weight of 10 years of carefully connected proof was simply too much to explain away. And when one nervous board member quietly admitted he'd received a generous consulting fee from Gideon around the same time as the original championship, the room's remaining doubt collapsed entirely. "This isn't over," Gideon said coldly, rising from his chair as security approached to escort him out, his eyes fixed on Narina with a fury too raw to hide anymore. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Narina said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "A man who was so afraid of losing that he destroyed a 17-year-old girl rather than risk her winning fairly. That's not power, Gideon. That's weakness wearing an expensive suit." The story broke publicly within days, and this time there was no tabloid twisting the narrative into something ugly. Miriam, given full support from her old network, eager to distance itself from its decade-old cover-up, published the entire investigation herself. Footage, financial trail, testimonies, everything laid bare for the public to see exactly what had happened to the girl once known as the Silver Swan. The Federation, desperate to repair its own credibility, announced a special comeback exhibition at the National Dance Championship, the same stage where Narina's career had been destroyed 10 years earlier. It wasn't a competition, it was a chance for the public and for Narina herself to reclaim what had been stolen. She stood backstage the night of the performance, hands trembling slightly as she stared out at the enormous hall filling with people, some who remembered her from a decade ago, most who only knew her from the viral gala video and the scandal that followed. "You don't have to do this," Cassian said quietly, standing beside her. "Nobody would blame you if you walked away right now. You've already won."
"I know," Narina said, "but I'm not doing this for the Federation or the public or even for justice anymore."
She looked at him, something calm and certain settling over her features.
I'm doing this for the 17-year-old girl who never got to finish her performance. I owe her this."
Cassian nodded, understanding completely. "Then go finish it." She stepped onto the stage to a swell of applause, the same lights that had once betrayed her, now glowing steady and safe above her, checked and rechecked personally by Cassian's own security team 3 times that day. For a moment, standing exactly where her career had ended a decade earlier, old fear threatened to rise in her chest. Then the music began, and she let it go. She danced not for revenge, not to prove anything to Gideon or the Federation or the crowd watching from the darkness beyond the stage lights. She danced the way she had in that quiet countryside ballroom weeks earlier, free, alive, entirely her own. Every turn carried 10 years of grief transformed into something steadier. Every movement told a story the audience could feel, even if they didn't know all its details. A woman who had been broken, buried, and forgotten, rising anyway. When the final note faded, she stood perfectly still, chest rising and falling, and for a moment, the entire hall was as silent as that first night at Moretti Royale had been. Then the applause came, thunderous and unrelenting, the crowd rising to their feet in a wave that seemed to shake the entire building. Somewhere in the audience, seated quietly instead of standing near the stage where he easily could have positioned himself, Cassian watched with an expression of quiet pride he made no effort to hide. This victory belonged entirely to her. He understood that completely, and he refused to take even a fraction of that moment away from her by inserting himself into it. 2 weeks later, the Federation formally cleared Narina's name in a public statement, officially reversing the original ruling on her championship and permanently banning Gideon Ashcroft from any involvement with the organization. Facing mounting evidence and a wave of public outrage, Gideon resigned from every board and charitable position he'd built his reputation on, his decade of carefully cultivated respectability collapsing within a matter of weeks. Criminal charges followed shortly after, built on the financial trail Cassian's team had uncovered. Backstage after the performance, Narina found Cassian waiting quietly near the exit, away from the reporters and well-wishers crowding the hallway. "You didn't come to congratulate me?" she asked, a small smile tugging at her lips despite her exhaustion.
"I didn't want to share you with anyone else tonight," Cassian admitted. "Not even for a moment." Narina studied him for a long moment, 10 years of walls finally completely dismantled. "Come here," she said softly. He crossed the distance between them, and for the first time since that night at Moretti Royale, when she'd first silenced an entire restaurant with nothing but her bare feet and buried grace, Cassian Moretti allowed himself to simply feel something without calculating what it might cost him. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Spring arrived early that year, warming the riverside garden behind Grovewood Rehabilitation Center weeks before the calendar promised it would. Narina stood at the edge of a small crowd gathered near a ribbon-tied entrance, her hands clasped together, trying to steady the nervous excitement fluttering in her chest. The sign above the entrance read, "The Silver Swan Academy of Dance, Scholarships for Dreamers." It had taken 4 months to build from the small seed of an idea into something real. After the Federation cleared her name and Gideon's downfall dominated headlines for weeks, Narina had been offered contracts, sponsorships, even invitations to compete internationally again. She turned most of them down. What she wanted instead was simpler and far more meaningful to her. A place where talented young dancers, without money or connections, could train without fear of someone more powerful deciding they didn't deserve to win. 10 scholarships to start, she told the small crowd of reporters and donors gathered for the opening. Every one of them fully funded, no strings attached. No one here will ever have to wonder if their dream is safe. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, half hidden by well-wishers who didn't fully understand who he was,
Cassian watched her speak with quiet pride that had become familiar to him over these past months. He had changed too, though the change came slower, more deliberately than Narina's. In the weeks following Gideon's very public downfall, Cassian had begun quietly restructuring the parts of his empire that lived in shadows, transferring authority away from the more dangerous ventures his father had built and reinvesting heavily into legitimate businesses instead: real estate, restaurants, a foundation supporting injured athletes that had, fittingly, grown out of the same charity gala where everything between them had truly begun. It wasn't a complete transformation. Cassian would never fully escape the world he'd inherited, and both of them understood that. But he no longer needed that world to define him, and increasingly, he found he didn't want it to.
"You could have stayed in the shadows," Narina told him once, watching him review paperwork for a new community center he was funding instead of the usual contracts that once crossed his desk. "Nobody would have questioned it. It's who you were."
"Who I was got my brother finished and taught me to trust no one," Cassian had said simply. "I'd rather be who I'm becoming." Inside the academy garden, Andre Vale sat in a chair near the ribbon-cutting ceremony, though he hadn't needed the wheelchair in almost 2 months now. He rose slowly, steadily, without assistance, to stand beside his daughter as she prepared to cut the ribbon. A small, quiet miracle that meant more to Narina than any championship title ever could.
"You did this," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "All of it, despite everything that man tried to take from you."
"We did this," Narina corrected gently, glancing toward where Cassian stood watching. "I couldn't have gotten here alone." The ribbon-cutting drew warm applause, followed by tours through the Academy's freshly built studios. Bright, spacious rooms with mirrors along every wall and sunlight streaming through tall windows. Nothing like the shadowed, sabotage-prone stage where her career had once nearly ended forever. 10 young students, ranging from 12 to 17 years old, moved nervously through their first orientation, each carrying the same quiet hope Narina remembered feeling herself once, before the world tried to convince her that hope was dangerous. As the celebration wound down into evening, string lights flickering to life along the garden's riverside pavilion, Cassian found Narina standing alone near the water, watching the last of the sunset fade behind the trees. "It's beautiful," he said, joining her.
"It is,"
she agreed, though her eyes stayed on him rather than the view. "Thank you for all of it, for refusing to let the truth stay buried even when I begged you to stop digging." "You would have found your way back to yourself eventually," Cassian said. "I just made sure it happened a little sooner, with a little less pain than it might have otherwise." Narina turned fully toward him, something soft and certain settling over her features. "Dance with me," she said quietly. "One more time." Cassian raised an eyebrow, something like his old, teasing confidence flickering back for just a moment. "Another dare?" "No," she said, smiling. "This time I'm asking, as an equal, not a challenge, not a performance for anyone else to judge. Just us." He took her hand without hesitation, and there, beside the quiet river with string lights glowing softly overhead and the academy she'd built rising behind them, they moved together. Not the precise, disciplined choreography of a championship stage, but something simpler and far more honest. 2 people who had each spent years building walls against a world that hurt them, finally choosing to let those walls fall. There were no judges watching this time. No sabotaged wiring hidden in the rafters, no cruel laughter waiting to mock a small mistake, no powerful man scheming in the shadows to decide who deserved to win. Just Narina Vale, no longer hiding from the girl she used to be, and Cassian Moretti, no longer defined by the empire he'd inherited. 2 people who had found, in each other, exactly what both of them had spent years afraid to believe still existed. A future built on trust, a future built on truth, and a love that neither of them had been looking for, but both of them, in the end, were more than ready to accept.